Stuart said you were going to talk about community, and he said, I said, what should I talk about? So he gave me my favourite topic, which is me. So I'm going to talk about my career path, right? And I will kind of make some comments about community as I go through. They won't all be particularly positive ones, right? Thank you. Okay, so what I'm going to do is talk about serendipity. And this is my favourite book, if any of you are really interested in reading outside the box. It's a book about serendipity, but it's written by this sociologist, Merton. I'm a sociologist, a qualitative one, who spent most of his life protesting about the fact that science constantly argues that they are involved in an objective, systematic process, where actually what he argues is that it's messy, it's inspiration, perspiration, error, and happy chance, i.e. serendipity. So in the book, actually, he talks about Harvard Medical School and the serendipitous finding of penicillin, but he also meets somebody who's in charge of serendipity in the United States Navy. There's actually somebody with the director of serendipity, which I think is wonderful. Anyway, so this is what I'm going to talk about, and this is me. Right, I haven't got a pointer, but this is me, aged, maybe 4 or 5, ready to get into the world. I was born in Salford, just down the road, so I do look a bit mucky. I was a bit mucky most of my childhood, actually. But anyway, I spent 18, 19 years in Salford, right? And in the 60s, I left school with 2 formal qualifications. I can't remember what they were called now, GCSEs, or they weren't certificates, were they? Those were later. One of them was in domestic science, because I was going to make somebody a really good wife, which is actually one of the things I've completely failed at in my life, really, but anyway. So I spent a bit of time working in Salford, a couple of years, and I spent 6 months as a teacher's assistant. I don't know how I managed to do that, but the other thing about me is I'm quite good at conning people, you know. So I was in a school teaching kids with domestic science, O-level or whatever it was. But then I was really lucky. Serendipity, right? The voluntary service overseas, I got into the last cohort of VSOs where you were not required to have any qualifications. This is the empire's arrogance, right? They send kids from Salford with domestic science O-levels out to Africa. We still tend to do that a little bit. But anyway, this was the last cohort in the 60s. Can't remember when it was. I think it was 67. I get out to Uganda just before Idi Amin takes over, right, to teach kids with leprosy. So I did that. Let's see. This is a picture of an amazing woman who had leprosy and her kids. These are the kids in the classroom, and I also taught kids who were blind. So this was all with no qualifications. So basically the lesson of life here, this particular point, was that I got a lot more out of this experience than Uganda did, right? It kind of made me, really, but it made me in a way which is a bit odd, because right in the top corner, I don't have a pointer, you can't see, there's a mountain, Kilimanjaro, which is right on the equator. It did have, actually, glaciers. They've gone now. But right on the equator, there's a mountain with glaciers, and I climbed it 2 or 3 times. So I got absolutely obsessed with landscapes and mountains and seas and rivers. So I went from Africa, where actually, serendipitously, I met a guy who gave me the name Popay. We didn't last very long because he didn't like my cooking. But what he did do was he mentored me through my A-levels by correspondence course. It was an Oxford college, so I've got my A-levels from Oxford. And so I went off to New Zealand with 3 A-levels because English universities wouldn't take me because I was too old. It's only in the last couple of decades that they've started to take mature students. So I go off to New Zealand, and in New Zealand, I go to university, and what did I do? I became a geomorphologist. So, and people say, what? I study landforms, right? And I spent a lot of time on volcanoes. Got the pictures there? Yeah, there you go. Counting pebbles on beaches. going up volcanoes and checking the seismological activity, etc. I did love it, actually. I really loved it. Well, this was the closest I got to quantitative research, actually. But I did it for a number of years, right? But then New Zealand's a long way away, so I did come back to the UK a few times, and I decided I wasn't particularly homesick for Salford. You know, I have a lot of respect for Salford, but I wasn't particularly homesick for Salford. But I was homesick, really, for, well, seasons, if nothing else, but also families. So then I came back to London in probably it was 1979, actually. And I worked in various advocacy groups and in London University when I got to Salford. I'm going to say in a minute how I got from geomorphology to health. I'll come back to that. But anyway, so in the right at the end of the 70s, I came back. I went to London. I spent almost 20 years in London working in research and advocacy, policy development, etc. And then, bugger me, but I ended up back in Salford, working actually at first with the NHS and then Salford University. And then I went through a number of research posts. So I was professor at Salford University. The most stunning experience at Salford University is I walked into the University Research Committee. It's the first professor, right? Walked into the Research Committee. And a guy, they were all men in the room, all men in the room. I think they had previously had one female professor, some 15 years previously. So, and he asked me if I'd come to take the notes. And that wasn't that long ago, you know. So I said, no, I've come to cook. So. Anyway, so eventually I ended up at Lancaster University, where I still am. I'm only working now, supposedly, well, I'm getting paid half-time, but some of the women in the room might recognise the phenomenon where you get paid for 50%, but you work 100% of your time. But that's where I am, that's what I'm doing. So for the last 30 years, I've spent raising grant income to do research. I don't teach. I dislike teaching, actually, primarily because I like mature students and not young people. My son thinks it's terrible, really, but there you go, I'm honest. And I was in my 40s before I got my first permanent contract. Before that, I was on a whole string of short-term contracts, which might be familiar with some of the people in the room who are working in universities on research contracts. So nothing changes despite the HEFKE Research Concordat, because I'm aware that there are still an awful lot of research fellows who are on what they now call permanent contracts, but your letter tells you when the grant runs out, you'll be out of work. So not really very permanent. So why the move to health? Well, it was another example of serendipity, really. When I came back to London in 1979, I was looking for a job in environmental planning. That's what I'd done. I'd gone to do some postgraduate work. But a friend took me to a seminar at the London School of Economics by Peter Townsend. Some of you may know Peter Townsend. He was a giant in social policy. And in 1979, his book, Poverty in the United Kingdom, was published, and he was talking about it at the London School of Economics. And call me naive, but I was shocked at the extent to which in 1979, after the golden years with the welfare state, with social housing, etc., we still had so many people living in real poverty. And it just transformed my perspective, really. I just was so outraged by this social injustice that Peter Townsend was talking about that I went off to Essex and did postgraduate work in social policy. And in particular, I moved into health inequalities. So this 1979 was the beginning of a lifelong commitment, really, to doing research on social justice and health inequalities. And in 1979, 1980, I naively thought that evidence could solve this problem, right? I don't believe this anymore, actually. I think evidence is valuable. I think research evidence is valuable, but it's not the solution. So I'm assuming you all know, but sometimes that assumption is not right. So let me just quickly flick through some of the quantitative data on health inequalities, right? This gradient, right, the gradient you all know, it's the metaphor for health inequalities. This is inequalities around the world, really. So down here, you've got countries with low per capita income, and up here, you've got countries with high per capita income. So on your right, it's Africa, Asia, and on your left, it's America, Canada, the United Kingdom. And what the lines are showing you is that even on a per capita income of $2,000 per head, this is deaths in children under 5 years. Even on that, you have a range of 200 deaths per thousand up to 10 deaths per thousand. At this point, I was going to break into song as well, but I won't sing it. But it's the message here is it's not what you do, it's the way that you do it. It's not how much money you've got, it's the way that you spend the money. Because at this end here, the difference is smaller, but even so, you've still got differences here. Significant differences in the number of kids under 5 that are dying despite the countries having the same income. And at this time, I can't remember what year this was, I think it was 2004, right? It's all the same. Go online, you can look at this. It's called the GAP website. You can look at life expectancy, anything. At this time, Cuba, which is right at the top there of that, had the same life expectancy as the USA. So really a pointer here that the causes are socioeconomic. And that gradient is, you can find it anywhere. This is life expectancy in the UK, across north and south, disadvantaged areas. So as it says here, in women, across relatively advantaged and disadvantaged areas, 6 years difference in life expectancy, 20 years difference in healthy life expectancy. 20 years difference in healthy life expectancy. And look where we are now. What century are we in? What a rich country we are. It's astonishing. And here, the north-south divide, you know. I mean, the amazing thing is, this graph here is disadvantaged areas in the north of England and disadvantaged areas in the south of England. Similarly disadvantaged areas in the north and the south of England. But you're lucky if you live in the south, you can be just as disadvantaged, but you'll have a longer life expectancy. What's going on there? What is the problem in the north? The north has a long history of disadvantage. And then finally, just to say that in Lancaster, a wealthy area, right? A wealthy area, we have still significant differences in life expectancy, in all-cause mortality, you name it, we've got inequalities. So that in the most disadvantaged areas of Lancaster, the area around Lancaster, 10 years shorter life for men and a 9 years shorter life for women. So this gradient is a kind of, it's a shame on us, really. On the health research community, on the policy community, on the politicians. The gradient, the recurring gradient. So what did I do? What did I do? Well, I didn't. It's all numbers, you know. We talk about inequalities in two ways. We talk about inequalities as numbers, and we talk about inequalities as bad behaviours. Those are the two ways in which we talk about inequalities, and they're the two ways in which we research inequalities. So I'm an awkward cuss. So what did I do? I focused on what I call practical wisdom, which is Aristotle's phrase. And practical wisdom is the knowledge that we all have based on our experience of everyday life. And what I did was, all these years, I've been doing research on practical wisdom of people living in disadvantaged circumstances, primarily in the UK, but I've done work in other countries. Because I believe that knowledge that those people acquire from living in very difficult circumstances, from experiencing social injustice, will help us to understand why most of the things we do to try and reduce inequalities are not working. So this is just to say that, going back to all those graphs, that basically in the public health world, in the healthcare research world, individuals are everywhere. People are everywhere. But the way we think about individuals is accumulation of risks, vulnerabilities, or sometimes the opposite, resiliences. We don't think about them as knowing people, people who understand their circumstances. And yes, you can talk about patient-centeredness and community-centeredness, but I'll come back to that. I think it's a con, you know. We listen, but we don't act. The professionals and the researchers. And so I think in the main, there's an absence of people's knowledge. There's a presence of people, but an absence of their knowledge. So that's what I've been doing. And what I found, some key messages from my research, is it's interesting. We did the cheering between professionals and lay. With the lay lost, the professionals won. It's a story of life, really, that, isn't it? But there are fault lines, serious, profound fault lines between the way in which people living in disadvantaged circumstances understand their lives and the way in which professional caregivers and some researchers understand their lives. These are just a few of them. So practical wisdom connects the experience and behaviour with material and social context. So you talk to people about breastfeeding, the people who won't do it, the women who won't do it. Talk to people about smoking, the people who won't stop. Talk to people about alcohol, the people who are dependent. And their stories are about using those behaviours as ways to cope. They're coping mechanisms. And if we remove coping mechanisms, they will find another way to cope, which might be equally health damaging. But what practical wisdom tells us is they know what they're doing. They know that it is damaging their health. They're making a rational decision in the context of their lives. Professionals see these behaviours. They fragment their behaviours. They see individuals, they don't think about the context, and they too often think about these behaviours almost as freely chosen. You know, in a sense, they're rational, but they're not freely chosen. Practical wisdom, then, is a logical assessment of the limits on people's lives. That's what they're doing. And if we listen, it suggests different ways of responding to those problems. So while lay people and professionals may share the same values, the implications for action are different. So the obsession in the NHS at the moment about making every contact count, you know, is context-free. I mean, I know people talk about it, but the fact that people are going back home to lives where they've got no jobs, where they've got income, where they can't afford to eat properly, where they can't afford to fulfill their prescriptions, making every contact count is not going to impact on their lives significantly. So here's just a joke. Some of you will have heard it. It's my favourite joke, which illustrates not just that practical wisdom is a source of evidence that we need to attend to, but people are politically literate as well. So when we go through austerity in the 1920s, in the 1940s, now, what we do is teach people how to use their low income better. Cookery classes. There's cookery classes everywhere now. Cooking on a low income, yeah? Because people don't know how to do it. They may not, but this particular class, this was drawn for me when I was talking in Glasgow by an amazing street artist. And she was teaching these women how to make cod's head soup. She wouldn't do that now, of course, because cod's too expensive, but it'd be another fish. And at the end, she said to the women, so have you got any questions? And the woman here is saying, yep, while we're eating the head, who's eating the cod? It's really intelligent, real kind of political literacy. So I think this knowledge that I've been studying is a source of evidence, it's a sort of political insight, it's potentially a source of more effective action to address health inequalities. So the second thing then I've done is question the dominant perspectives on health inequalities and what can be done about them. So I've studied practical wisdom, and then I've thought about what does that mean for the way we think about health inequalities. I haven't got a timer here. I don't know how I'm doing for time, but I do tend to deviate, so I'm probably running out of time. So I went online and looked at the way in which we present health inequalities. And this is it. There are many, many, many images like this. Stigma? Whoa, we're really stigmatizing people who are living really tough lives. So there's loads of fat bellies online, lots of pints of beer, young people hour their heads on drugs, smoking. But also the positive image. What's the positive image? It's people running around parks, you know, jogging, always with your gear, with your little black, whatever it's called, pedometer, I'm not sure what it's called. This is the image of health inequalities, right? It's not generally unemployment. It's not generally lousy housing. It's not generally markers of how unequal our society is in terms of income. It's all about behaviour and lifestyles. And these are just some of the examples of the types of things that this approach leads to, which are initiatives that are incentivising good behaviour. So now we're paying people to change their behaviour, right? We're paying kids to eat fruit and veg. We're paying women to breastfeed. Bupa are paying people to exercise. They're paying people to exercise because they save money if you do that. But it's not people living in difficult circumstances. So lifestyle is the preoccupation, and behaviour change initiatives that do not take account of context are the response. Actually, Banksy, wonderful guy with practical wisdom, has a response to this. Let me just go one on and show you Banksy's response. This is on an office block in London. Yeah. Sorry, the lifestyle you ordered is out of stock. And this is just a quickie. Amartya Sen says that we're living in a sick and unjust world. And these are just some examples of that. You don't need to see the detail, but the top one there, the very top one in the middle with the little red line, is income inequality in the 30 richest countries. We're the 7th most unequal country. That was 2012. We will be now probably the 5th or 4th most unequal country out of the top 30 rich countries. Did you know that? Most people don't know that. It's really shameful. So, sorry, lifestyle, that's out of stock. And so the third thing I've focused on, though, if the common response is to incentivize people to change behavior, it's not working with people living in the most difficult circumstances. So the best it does is leave inequalities unchanged. The worst it does is widen them. Because those of us living privileged lives, or just comfortable lives, we can change our behaviour. Because those behaviours do tend to be habits rather than coping strategies. Well, that's not always the case. But people living in the most difficult circumstances don't change their behaviours that easily. They might change it immediately after a brief encounter with the NHS. They might change it for 6 months. They might change it for a year. But Hilary Graham has done this wonderful work on women smoking, where she says women may stop smoking when they're pregnant for their children's health, but poor women are more likely to go back to smoking. And they don't see that as a relapse. They don't see it as a relapse because they only stopped temporarily. They stopped for their children. So it's a return. It's a return to a coping strategy. That's really important for those people who are trying to change behaviour. So what I'm focusing on now is this notion of community or collective control. So here comes my community. And I think the health research community could be a force for change in shifting this agenda around health inequalities to an upstream agenda that recognised that people's health in difficult circumstances can only be improved if you change those circumstances. If we change the welfare system so it is not so victim-blaming as it is now, if we improve housing, if we give people decent jobs, that's how we will improve the health of those in the poorest health. And this little graph here is just an example of what will happen if you give communities real control over their living conditions. Now, I mean real control, which means being able to have a voice with politicians, real influence over, and real influence over research as well. This was in Canada, where they discovered that the suicide rate amongst the First Nations in Canada, the Aboriginal peoples, is 5 or 10 times higher than the white population. But this group in British Columbia, led by Chalmers, said, but actually within First Nation, there's many different First Nations in British Columbia, there were big differences in suicide rates. So in some First Nations, there was no youth suicide, and in others, it was 20 times higher than the white population. So he logically concluded, this is not about indigeneity, because otherwise you'd have high rates in all the First Nation groups. So they constructed this measure of what they call cultural continuity. Actually, it's a measure of control, collective control by First Nations. So their indicators were, have they got their land back? Have they succeeded in getting their land back? Have they got self-government? Have they got control over health and education services? Have they got dedicated cultural facilities? Really measures of control. They call it cultural continuity. A stake in the future of their culture is what they were talking about. And as you can see here, those First Nations that had all of those indicators of control had no youth suicide. And those First Nations over on this side that had none of those indicators of control, they had the highest, it's the other way around, they had the highest rates of suicide. So this suggests that actually giving communities real control over the decisions that impact on their lives can be a really major, can have a really major impact on health inequalities. So my current research, at the age of 70, is evaluating experiments in community. In this country, we call it engagement. We call it empowerment. Basically, these are experiments in giving communities real control over decisions. And the two examples that I'm focusing on are something called Big Local, where the lottery is giving 150 communities around England £1 million to spend as they wish to spend it to improve their area. And the other one is People's Health Trust Local Conversations, where they're giving communities similar amounts of money and saying, you spend it to improve your neighbourhood in the way you want to improve it. And this is working. This is working, right? People are, what they're doing is improving their neighbourhood, but they're also, for example, setting up schemes for apprentices. And they're doing it in partnership with local firms. So one of these neighbourhoods said to Tesco, you bring your supermarket here, we will train the local people to work in the supermarket, and we will subsidise some apprentices with our money for 2 years. And that's what they've done. So Tesco have come, and they are employing local people, not bringing people in. So they're doing really significant things, these communities, with this money. One of the early findings from our research, however, is looking at other community approaches, patient-centred approaches, community-centred approaches in public health, is that actually in the context of austerity, some of these approaches are actually DIY welfare, because they're not giving communities resources, they're just giving them responsibility without supporting them. So we have to be aware, we have to be thoughtful about these community initiatives. They're not all going to have positive impacts on the communities. So here I am, still at Lancaster, trying to learn the guitar and Spanish in the other half of my time, not doing that so well. So what are the lessons from this particular career? So I was thinking about this. I haven't got a kind of script for this, but I think, I don't know, the lessons for me are that all of our pathways in research are serendipitous, right? You might try and plan them. I certainly might try and plan it a bit more than I did. And your pathway might not be as exciting as my pathway, but it will be serendipitous. There will be opportunities that you didn't expect that come up. And you need to, yes, you need to plan. That's important. But you need to be open to these serendipitous opportunities to do things differently within the research community, to move the research community. So but the other lesson for me is, yes, in this pathway I made lots of networks. Loads of networks, right? I met lots of people. And that's really, really important. And friendship is really, really important. But as this slide suggests, you can't see it here. This is a wonderful African tree. But if you look really closely, there's some lions in that tree. You probably can't see them in there. But in any community, you know, there are some lions. And I think that the narrative about the complementarity of quantitative and qualitative research is a bit dangerous, really. Because what happens is that qualitative researchers get to do what is complementary to the quantitative research. And one of the lessons from my career, I think, it's not a comfortable position to be in, but some of the most important work that qualitative researchers can do is to challenge the quantitative, right? So challenge that picture of health inequalities as risks, vulnerabilities, behaviour and lifestyle. Not do qualitative research that compounds that problem, right? So you don't do qualitative research to help implement behavioural interventions. You do qualitative research that might actually illuminate why those interventions are not working. So I think that notion of, yes, community is important, but watch out for the lions in the trees, yeah? Those trees look really, really nice, but there are lots of lions up there. And the other final point I would say is that what my research has taught me, this is like a Myers-Briggs seminar, right, is I'm a big picture person, right, but I also do love the detail. This is a road sign that I found in Australia. It really was on the side of the road in Australia. And it's very funny, isn't it? This sign has sharp edges, but look right at the bottom. The bridge is out up ahead. Right? And you're so busy focusing on the big picture that you miss the little picture. So I'm a big picture person. Myers-Briggs always says, you're over there, I can't remember the extrovert, I can't remember all the categories. But actually, I've taught myself to attend to the detail as well, because I think you do need both. And that's why I do the work on practical wisdom, on people's stories, as well as the work that is challenging behaviour and lifestyle perspectives. So that's my story. Thanks very much for inviting me.